So, in this module, we're going to talk about some stuff that is super powerful. And the reason why it's super powerful is because it is supernatural. We're going to be talking about things that we organically do by nature all of the time. So remember that I told you in the beginning of the training that anything that I try to share with other people, I always try to share stuff that does not go against the grain of human behavior or the human thought cycle. So, for example, one of the things that drives me crazy, especially in the self help space, is when people say, don't compare yourself to other people. And that's the advice that a lot of self help gurus give. They say, don't compare yourself to other people. And I think that that is faulty advice because we are organically designed by nature to compare ourselves to other people. If you read anything about social psychology, you'll find out that there's something called social comparison, which tells us that human beings by nature compare themselves to other human beings to measure themselves. It's something that we do naturally. So if you tell somebody not to do that, you're essentially setting them up for failure. Now, telling somebody not to compare themselves to someone else and let that ruin them or let that bother them or let that affect them negatively is one thing. But telling them not to do it is just something that's not good. And so that's why I never give advice and I never teach things to people that go against the grain of human nature. And so, while a lot of the stuff that we're going to be studying, especially in the upcoming modules with the specific hypnotic language patterns that we're going to be touching on, initially they might not feel natural to you and you're going to have to practice them and get them down. But what we're going to talk about here should come very natural to you because this is something that you're probably doing all the time anyway without realizing it. And that is using metaphors, stories, and analogies. These three things allow us to use symbols and patterns that are useful for subjects to mirror in their own lives. So, one of the most powerful ways to communicate with someone is to utilize their imagination because we think in terms of pictures. So if I tell you try not to think of a pink elephant, what happens? A pink elephant appears in your mind. If I tell you think about what happens when you bite into a lemon, what happens? You can instantly taste the lemon in your mouth. You might even start to secrete a little bit in your mouth from tasting it. If I tell you to imagine what a watermelon tastes like, you can imagine it exactly in your mind's eye what it tastes like. And that's because as human beings, we think in terms of pictures. And that's the reason why we're using metaphors and stories and analogies all the time anyway, even if you know nothing about hypnotic language, if you knew nothing about influence and persuasion and communication strategies, you're using this stuff organically by nature anyway because you think in terms of pictures. And because everyone thinks in terms of pictures, we describe things in terms of pictures, and that's why we utilize metaphors, stories, and analogies. But what I'm going to show you here is how to use them a little bit more strategically, a little bit more systematically, and we're going to polish them up a little bit so that they're ultra effective when you use them. So let's talk about the definition of metaphors, stories, and analogies. What is a metaphor? A metaphor is a figure of speech in which a phrase is applied to an object or action to which it is only symbolically applicable, but not literally applicable. So, for example, she'd fallen through a tar pit of depression, or he was stuck in an endless cycle, a prison of repeated behaviors. So, when we talk about the tar pit of depression, or the endless cycle, or the prison, we're not talking about a physical tar pit, we're not talking about a physical cycle, and we're not talking about a physical prison. We're talking about a figure of speech which represents an object, an action, or a situation, but is easily able to be constructed in the mind of the subject. Again, because people think in terms of images and pictures. What is a story? A story is an account of imaginary or real people or events. Most people align themselves with the hero in a story. Now, I tell people all the time, one of the top communication tips that I give people, whether it's influence, persuasion, delivering a keynote speech, a sales presentation, whatever it may be, you should always incorporate story into your repertoire. Story may be the most powerful form of communication that exists. It's certainly the oldest form, I would argue, of communication that exists. I mean, if we think back to primitive times when people first started communicating with each other, this was the way that people taught each other how to do things. So if a guy was sitting in the middle of the forest and up until that point he killed his prey with a spear, and he suddenly figured out that there was an easier way to do it by setting a trap, he would go back and he would tell the tribe of his people how he was sitting there and he was trying to kill a rabbit or kill some sort of prey with a spear. And then suddenly it dawned on him that if he connected 3 pieces of wood with a string, he could set a trap, and the trap could catch the prey for him while he was sleeping, so he could save time. And he would recount the story of exactly how he did that. Well, this has transcended time and stood with us for thousands of years, and it's the reason why we are so receptive to stories. It's the reason why the Hollywood film industry grosses billions of dollars every year. It's the reason why the book industry grosses so much money, because people can relate and can respond to stories. Think about what happens when you watch a really good movie. When you watch a really good movie, you can't help but begin to identify with all of the different events and things that the main hero or the main character in the story is experiencing. You essentially project yourself into that story, and that's what makes them so powerful. What's an analogy? An analogy is a comparison between two things based on their structure for clarification. So, for example, the seasons of nature could be compared to a person's life. You could say that they start out in spring and they blossom like a flower. It's a time of birth and a time of growth. And then they move on to summer, where they experience heat and maybe some tough times in their life, or they just experience life for what it is. And then in the fall they start to get older, just as the trees, as the leaves start to fall off the trees, slowly things start to die. And then in the winter just represents dark and death. So it's a comparison between two things based on their structure for clarification. I personally love analogies and I love metaphors. And sometimes I'll combine them. You know, for example, sometimes when I hear about people that whine and complain about not having money but don't ever want to get a job or don't want to work or don't want to take action or don't want to try to educate themselves, I'll often say that these people are waiting for someone to ring their doorbell and hand them a bag of cash or hand them a bag with the answer to all their problems. So the metaphor is the bag, and the analogy is the answer to all of their problems, right? Because you couldn't really put someone's answers to problems in a bag, but you can compare it as an analogy. Metaphors, stories, and analogies are useful to mirror patterns of human behavior. So once again, we're utilizing what people are doing by nature already, but we're leveraging it. So these techniques allow subjects to see their situation more clearly and to understand more fully the resolution to their problem or challenge. So a lot of times you might be in a situation where you're trying to influence, persuade, sell, or maybe just convey a point, but for whatever reason, the person isn't really absorbing your message as best as they possibly could or the way that you want them to. So you utilize these strategies, the metaphor of a story and the analogy, to help paint a clearer picture so that your message sticks with them. Stories, metaphors, or analogies can provide a pattern for the person or the subject's response. Even a totally generic metaphor can seem to be specific if the hypnotist sets it up in that way. Each individual in the audience will think that you custom made that metaphor for them. And that's super powerful. I mean, if you think about that, if you're giving a speech to 1,500 people and your goal is to connect with as many people in that room as possible, if you set up a metaphor in a certain way, every person in that audience will relate to it in some way, shape, or form, because if you use the right metaphor, they will likely have experienced something similar to that in their life. And that's powerful. That's super powerful. That's when you start to really magnify your influence, when it's almost like you're casting this sphere of influence on multiple people. Metaphor is a very powerful way to do that. So client or subject metaphors can be used by the hypnotist and are even more effective than ones you can create. Metaphors don't have to be long or complicated. A subject might use a single phrase or simple sentence or even a gesture that is metaphorical in nature. You as the hypnotist can then build on that metaphor to deepen the client's experience. So again, circling back to what we do by nature anyway, because your target subject, prospect, whatever you want to call them, thinks in terms of pictures, it's very likely that if you're having an in-depth conversation with them, they're eventually going to use a metaphor. So all you simply do is take that metaphor that they're already using and build on it to strengthen the line of communication. So for example, let's say a subject says something like, "I'm stuck on a fast-moving merry-go-round." You can continue to build on that metaphor to change that picture or alter it so that it has meaning for that subject. So you could say something like, "Well, what do you think you need to do to get that merry-go-round to finally stop and take control back of your life so that you don't wind up on another merry-go-round or even worse, on a roller coaster?" You see, you're keeping the nature of the conversation in the same context that they're used to speaking about it, which is ultra effective. Listen to people. Listen to your subjects with care, and you will discover stories, metaphors, and analogies. You'll discover all the different ones that they use. You can then create a parallel structure to guide them to the desired outcomes. And again, this goes back to mirroring and matching and pacing and leading. The more you study human communication and you master it, the more you'll realize that you need to pay attention when you communicate with other people to the signals that they give you. And the easiest way to align your frequencies, as we talked about before, that's what this is all about. It's about getting your frequency, which is in one place, aligned with their frequency, which is somewhere else. The easiest way to do that is to first jump on their frequency and then slowly try to bring them onto yours. And you do that by using similar language, by using linguistics that they can relate to. So pay very close attention to the metaphors, stories, and analogies that they use so that you can use them when speaking to them. Metaphors can help you overcome resistance. It puts the subject into a creative frame of mind, just like as if he or she were interpreting a poem or song lyrics. You can use past successes of other subjects, clients, customers, prospects, to tell a story that listeners will apply themselves and their future success to. You can use your own quotes as embedded commands or suggestions. So for example, I said to him that to truly relax, he needed to wrap up his work 10 minutes before actually leaving his office. Here the subject is listening and applying this story and embedded command to him or herself. Key words that you use to set up metaphors would be things like journeys, pathways, new vistas, changing circumstances, yearning for something, hoping to get rid of something. These are all common patterns. Get the subjects to open up about their adventures in life and then turn around and use these experiences to bring them along into the trance state. Common patterns crop up in all different fields. We talk in metaphor on a daily basis. We don't notice. We talk about being left in the field, or being left in the dust, or hitting a home run. We do this by nature already. Bring things up in a conversation and then pay attention to the types of metaphors, stories, and analogies used frequently by people in that field. So, if you're in a certain space, in a certain niche, in a certain industry, it's very likely that there is a type of jargon or a type of universal language that people speak in that space, niche, area, industry. And it's very likely that they also use similar types of stories, metaphors, and analogies. Tune into that and pay very close attention to it. Ask your subjects about their favorite stories, books, toys, movies, and then adapt the metaphors you use to meet their needs. In that way, they may be even more effective than metaphors you create, because you can be sure they have personal meaning to the subject. So in summary, both very specific and very generic metaphors can work in the right context. I'll give you an example. I have a lot of friends that are police officers or retired police officers. And oftentimes, if I'm trying to make a point to them, or I'm trying to give them an example about something, I will often create a story in a police officer's shoes. So if I was talking about how to communicate effectively and how to reduce resistance, I would say that, a typical example is that if I get pulled over by a cop, even if I did nothing wrong, I'm never defensive. I'm always respectful. If the officer accuses me of doing something, so if he says to me, well, you didn't put your signal on when you made that turn, and let's say, for example, I know for a fact that I put my signal on, I still wouldn't turn around and tell the officer, no, you're absolutely wrong. I know that I put my signal on. You don't know what you're talking about. Instead, I would say something like, well, officer, I don't want to tell you that you're wrong, and you may be right that maybe I didn't put my signal on when I made the turn, but I'm pretty sure that I did, because I usually do it every single time. I've made it a habit to do that. So I'm asking you to reconsider your opinion. A lot different than just coming across and barking at someone. And so I usually tell that story when my friends, when I first meet them and they ask me what I do, and I say, well, I teach communication strategies and techniques to people, I'll give them that example, because that's something that they can relate to. So pay attention to the way people speak, pay attention to the context that's going on, and utilize stories, analogies, and metaphors appropriately.